Baratta.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hang on a second.
Okay.
Yeah, shall I just quickly introduce you? Our first speaker is Alex Baratta, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester, focusing on linguistic rights, linguistic prejudice, language, and identity. His recent work has investigated accentism in British teaching, as well as World Englishes, something I'm also very interested in, working on things such as China English and the implications they have for our students' assessments. I should also quickly reintroduce myself. I'm Shzr Ee Tan, the exiting co-chair of EDIMS, Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion Music Studies, and the vice dean of EDI and at the School of Digital and Performing and Digital Arts at Royal Holloway, London. So over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and hello, everybody. Yeah, I am a linguist. Originally, I was a music student, a composition student specifically. And as a brief intro before I get into my slides, I know in music, when I was studying it, there are certain sounds which tend to be agreed upon as being discordant, like major sevenths. This is taking me back a while, or perfect fourths, perfect. And I'm applying this not specifically, but I just think about that as a segue into the focus, which is on accent prejudice in British teaching. Because I think when we hear certain accents, we can all say that accent sounds beautiful, it sounds trustworthy, it sounds sexy, it sounds friendly, or, disparaging comments such as she's pretty, he's handsome till they open their mouth, this kind of stuff. It does go on. Are there sounds which are inherently unattractive? And then not in terms of music, because I think with music, maybe, I'm not sure. With linguistics, I would say no. I don't think any sound or combination of sounds in a conversation are inherently one or the other. That's a societal reality, which I think can involve knee-jerk reactions about certain sounds sounding ugly or unattractive, or the opposite, as the case may be. But the linguistic reality is, of course, it's just simply sounds, what we call phonemes, which represent how people with different accents pronounce the same words differently. So I only have a few slides. It's from a much larger set of slides in a study I did. But I'm just going to focus on, for time, just the most pertinent slides, a brief intro of my methods, and then the results. Can everyone see the slides saying the linguistic reality? Great, thank you so much. So what I wanted to do is at the bottom, we have 4 transcriptions of the word nurse based on how different speakers would pronounce that same word. And we can hear these 4 accents and maybe make judgments. If someone were to be your nurse, hello, my name is, I will be your nurse, as they probably would introduce themselves. Would you have any remotely negative or positive perception of them based on how they pronounce that simple word? Let's say they all aced training, which of course they must have to be a nurse. Their CVs are brilliant, but their phonemes rub you the wrong way, or the opposite. So what we have from left to right, we would have first received pronunciation, RP, which is, I would say, historically, unofficially, at least, the standard British or certainly English accent. So nurse is nurse. The second example would be a strong Liverpool accent. So nurse becomes nurse. Then the third one would be me, nurse, because I pronounce the R. More on that later. And fourth, an accent tied to New York City, northern New Jersey, where nurse becomes nice. So nurse, 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 nice. Now, I've asked my students, you don't have to answer this, but if someone did pronounce any of those ways and they were your nurse, would you have any perceptions? Would you judge them any less in their ability to take care of you versus if they say, I'll be a nurse versus I'll be an ass or nurse or nice? I mean, would it matter? Don't have to answer. I'm not saying you do have a perception. I mean, ideally, we shouldn't care one way or the other. That would be the best. So what I wanted to do was look at this in terms of teacher training in Britain, where teachers have a year training and they have a mentor who guides them through the training process. And what I found was, certain accents are being told, or speakers of accents are being told to modify them. No one's being told to go from broad Mancunian to RP, not change your accent, just to simply modify. So to go from a less broad realization to a more, we might say, general, and so on. So what I did is I had a study initially of 92 people, all from Britain, and just asked them, do you modify your accent? How does it contribute to your identity? Why do you do it? How do you do it? 6 of the participants were teachers, all admitted to doing it or being told to do it. And so I thought, let's focus just on teachers. So I had 3 more studies to follow, which had a total of, including the first 6, 41 teachers. So it's very small scale. I'm not here to make generalizations. I just wanted to investigate. And they were mostly teaching primary. A lot were teaching secondary, though, both public and private schools, a variety of subjects. So English, art, music, math, and so on. With that in mind, just going ahead now, just skipping through these slides, the results are, it was mostly the Northern and Midlands teachers who were told to modify their accents. And this is for those who are teaching in the same region. So it's not as if they're moving to another part of the country. For the most part, they're staying within Yorkshire, Manchester, or whatever the case may be. There was one teacher, though, who was a bit of an outlier in terms of the quite harsh criticism from her mentor. She is from Croydon. Her accent was described as, quote, strong South London. The mentor told her her accent was unprofessional. She teaches secondary art. And he told her to write the word water with a capital T. So she would avoid the glottal stop. So she would avoid saying woa, because to him that was unprofessional. Now, her mind, it was purely professional, because if as a teacher, you sound like your students, and they all have broad, in this case, London accents. She felt the students could warm up to her more, feel more comfortable talking to her, feel more comfortable approaching her, precisely because by not modifying her accent, she felt she sent the message that I'm still me. I'm being more real, more authentic. And for her, that meant a lot. And the students, she felt, her account was they were more close to her as a result. They just trusted her more. Teachers in the North Midlands, again, Manchester, Yorkshire, were being told to take on more Southern phonemes. So the Northern Bath, bos, becoming more Bath, bas. One teacher from Yorkshire in particular, he was told to avoid monophthongs. Those are what we might call pure vowels. So in words like go home, he referenced go home as reflecting, quote, his teacher me. But the home me, as a Yorkshire individual, was realized as go home. And he was discouraged from speaking like that by the mentor, because in his mind, and he had no problem, because in his mind, you've got to get it right in terms of pronunciation, but that's, a loaded word. There is a standard English in Britain and the US and Canada, but standard English refers to grammar and vocabulary. I think all of us today will speak standard English, but we're not going to sound the same. So when we say there's a standard for accent, I think we get into a bit of trouble there, because officially there is no standard British accent. Even though RP has now been rebranded as Standard Southern British English, I think it's a bit of a loaded word, because that suggests that everything outside of that is non-standard. But what is a non-standard accent? I think linguistically there is no reality for that question. But socioculturally, I think it's easy. If you have glottal stops and say things like, well, that's non-standard. It's stigmatized. It's not just the South. If you think of the TV show, what was it, Shameless, Frank Gallagher, he had a very broad Mancunian accent. I know he said things like "pae." So that's seen as very much non-standard. In Arabic, though, glottal stops are very common. I don't think any Arabic speaker from the Gulf to Morocco would see it as anything problematic. So a lot of these times when we say sounds are the problem, and certain sounds is the reason I don't like a certain accent. I think it's not the sounds. I think what it is the stereotypes that accompany the sounds. I think we hear stereotypes, not sounds per se. So one example, a broad Liverpool accent, for any word which ends with the k sound, a K, it becomes more like the technical name, a velar fricative. So I'll be back would become I'll be back. Now, some people might hear that sound and say it sounds like you're clearing your throat. And even Liverpudlians have written, ironically, of course, about the accent. It's part Lancashire, it's part Dublin, it's part congestion. But if we hear that exact same sound in Spanish, the Spanish J is exactly the same sound, like jamon. Now it sounds sexy. Now it sounds romantic. You see, it's very fickle. So I don't think there's anything inherent about sounds in terms of sounds of language and speech. I do apologize. I should have made this bigger. I'm just going to do that. It's just not letting me right now. Just rather than waste time, then I'll just go on to the next one. So here are some of the comments made by the mentors to the teacher trainees. So the first one, the trainee was in front of her mentor group. She's from the Midlands, from Nottingham, but is teaching in the South and is teaching as a primary school teacher of phonics. And the mentor said, as you can see, if you cannot or will not adapt Southern pronunciation, best to go back to where you come from. In the end, they had someone from the South who could demonstrate the Southern phonemes for teaching of phonics. An individual from Lancashire who I did meet at a conference. He was going for an interview for PGCE. The interviewer told him that he was going to stop the interview unless he changed his accent with a broad Lancashire accent, because the interviewer said, if you teach English, they're going to complain. The teachers, not the teachers, the students will complain to their parents, who will complain to the teachers, the head teacher, and say, why have you hired this man to teach English? And he even referenced it was not standard pronunciation. So that, again, what is standard pronunciation? So just to wrap up, what I've tried to find based on the results is that what is it about accents which makes them, quote, broad, and then susceptible to judgments about working class, which shouldn't mean anything, one or the other. But unfortunately, I think it does. If we judge people to be working class, then it might be seen as playing devil's advocate here, less educated, common, et cetera, these kind of things. And it is a fact linguistically that working class individuals tend to have the more broad realizations of regional accents. Middle class and upper class doesn't mean they speak RP, but they get away from the more broad realizations. And what does that mean? It simply means the sounds, which in just one word can pinpoint you to a given city, region, and maybe even a given locality within the city. Sometimes one word is all you need. For those who remove those sounds, then it's going to take maybe a couple of sentences before we start to think, wait a second, you from Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham? A broad accent we know right away. So here are some examples. Nurse, with a Liverpool, the sound becomes like a short E extended. So nice, birthday. And then back, as I said already, at the end of a word, the k becomes a bah. So the nice came back is the best example I can give. In one sentence, we know you're a Scouser. And then anything that's connected with that in terms of negative imagery is passed on to the speaker, or positive, depends who the listener is. It's in the ear of the beholder, so to speak. So what I found was I just took a certain word, Saturday, as I would say it, and looking at the local accents where I'm at here in Manchester, for accents deemed to be, quote, posh or neutral or the classic when people say, oh, I don't have an accent. Well, of course you do. You just don't have a stigmatized accent because you remove the broad sound. So locally, it might come across as Saturday. And people will say it does not sound Mancunian at all. And that's the point. You're trying to get away from the area by removing those telltale sounds, what I call phonological giveaways. More general, Saturday, Saturday. And then broad, we have Saturday, and finally Saturday, going from left to right, top to bottom. So we go from Saturday to Saturday. So it has a glottal stop. It has that what's called happy vowel. So where a word ends with an E sound like happy, it becomes I, happy. My daughter is Sophie. Is that stigmatized? And again, none of these sounds inherently are one or the other. If they built the capital of Britain on the River Mersey, then the accent we know as Liverpool would have been the prestige accent. And I don't know where that would leave RP. It's arbitrary. So it's not so much the accent or the actual language like Standard English has any inherent power. Standard English does not have any inherently more logical grammar than non-standard. It's simply the people who have the power, and it's transferred onto the language they speak. So accent is nothing more than a series of sounds in specific placements. I would completely disagree that sounds per se do not have any inherentness. There's nothing inherently educated if you say bath versus bath. There's nothing inherently uneducated if you say bus and not bus. And Southerners have the sound like in foot. So it's nothing about that. It's just simply the power we ascribe to the speakers who have the economic, the political power, which is why London English was chosen to be the standard variety. And in turn, the Southeast accent, RP, was chosen to be the standard accent. True, it is not a regional accent now, it's class-based, but originally it was based in the Southeast upper class pronunciation. So I think I've done it just in 15 minutes. So I'm going to stop there. I'll stop sharing. Happy to share the slides if anyone wants them, but I'm open now to any questions. If anyone has any questions at all. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Alex.
Thanks.
Could I also quickly invite people to, before they speak, introduce yourselves and then maybe give a short description in case we have people who have a visual disability who might want to know what you look like, who might be watching this later on. So I guess while people are processing your very rich talk, I do have a question of my own. And I completely agree with you in terms of how, everything is so enculturated, and there is no, so-called universalist approach to understanding how these sounds map and how they're signified. I am, and I can attest to the fact that, the major seventh, which is heard as dissonant in some cultures, is not, and Thai scales that are equiheptatonic. Okay, don't let me rant. We do have a question from Jenevora. Over to you.
Hi, I'm Jenevora Williams. I'm going to be speaking later, but just for those who may not see me, I'm Southern, posh, white, English, female. I'm thinking about the borderline between language as communication and when that line is crossed and somebody's accent is so unfamiliar to the person they're speaking to that they are difficult to understand. And where does that come? Where does that line come? We know that, for example, Glaswegian, if somebody has a very strong Glaswegian accent, it's difficult for somebody from North America to understand them because It's just outside their comprehension. They've never heard it before. At what point would one say this is actually not going to work very well? In terms of understanding, not in terms of prejudice, class, education, anything like that.
That's a good question because, especially in aviation, I found out recently 70% of airline, if not crashes, communication issues are because of lack of understanding. Not just because of accent, though. It could be other things, too. That was part of it. So, and especially if you're teaching, you need to be understood. So that was the rationale used by the mentors, with the exception of two who said it was unprofessional. So that's more of a prejudicial stance. But the fact that those teachers were teaching in their home region, for the most part, I think for the mentors, it can be kind of like a blanket. Oh, you need to be understood. But yeah, if someone is not understood, simply because it's an unfamiliar accent, which is completely objective, it's very neutral. I think all accents are understandable. It's just what we're used to. We're not used to Glaswegian, and certainly not in North America. We might be more used to a more Edinburgh accent if we hear Scottish accents at all. So that is certainly a topic that needs to be addressed because that's a purely practical issue. And if it's based on job-based, communication understanding, then that's a fair comment. I don't know how it would be approached though, without, in some cases, making people feel, oh, you're getting me from my accent. No, we're not. We just don't understand because we're from this part of the world and you're from there. We just don't understand. Nowadays, it could be a minefield. It shouldn't be, but it is something that. But I mean, it's what you're used to. My dad was from New York. I heard him every day of my life. But once he asked if we go to a pawn shop, I thought he said porn. And for a few seconds, I was, porn. It sounds the same. So I didn't understand. So, and that tells you, so that's family. So it's a good point. And I agree. If we don't understand each other, then we need to understand if it is about certainly the workplace, especially if it's up in the air. But how to approach that? That'd be I never had to so far, and I hope I never do.
Because the issue is as much with the listener as with the speaker.
Yeah, definitely. Because obviously a conversation has to go both ways, and if you don't understand the message, and that's happened to me sometimes, I've had to, not just asking directions, and I felt uncomfortable saying I didn't understand a word you just said. And this is again the States. It's not like I'm somewhere in a foreign country. Just never hearing a Philadelphia accent, for example. The guy had to repeat himself. I didn't know what he said. It's awkward. but it's a relevant point. We need to understand, especially in work-based communication context.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess following from that, there is the other questions who's got to do the effective labor of understanding. And sometimes, you know, in a split-second emergency, it's very hard versus sort of long-term approaches. I do have a follow-up question, and this is especially in context to our gathering, which is on Zoom. And I have a question about code switching between accents. For example, I guess some people might feel that I'm sounding North American based on all sorts of reasons, childhood exposure, lived experience, but maybe I might choose to sound more English in this situation. And we are in the virtual space where I guess this ostensibly is held in British daylight saving time, but increasingly with conferences, symposia, meetings, you know, just everyday exchanges happening on Zoom. How do people decide how to code switch? You know, quite apart from, and I'll switch to Singlish now. How do people decide what, you know, what accent to pick? Are they told, and what sort of decisions are going through their head when they're trying to reach out to a certain audience as opposed to feeling authentic? So I don't know how much Singlish you're able to decipher, but
I understood just fine. I understood all three. I think it's code switching. I think even if we only speak one language, we still code switch. If we go from standard British to local dialect, that's code switching. I think a lot of the choices we make are below the radar. I don't think we necessarily always consciously, we do sometimes, we have a strategy. I better speak this way for this audience, like a conference, something that's high prestige, high stakes. But I think very often we just start to do it and don't even realize until someone says, oh, look, your accent's changed. Oh, really? I didn't notice. I think very often we just make all our linguistic choices kind of instinctively, whether it's changing vocabulary, formality, in this case, pronunciation. But I think we do it because we just have a kind of language instinct, I would say, in terms of knowing the audience. I guess what the Koreans would call nunchi. You just know the audience, you know how to speak, or what you feel is appropriate for that audience. You just switch to 3 different accents, and you know, there might be 3 different perceptions of you. Not from me, because I know why you're doing it. It was very conscious. Yeah, of course, I thought you're from the States, but then you switched to more English and Singlish. So I think it's all about, I think we want to fit in. I think it's the bottom line. We all want to fit in. I don't mean that of you. I just mean in general, this is what studies have shown, not my own. And it seems obvious, but you know, we still need to research this. We want to fit in. We want to put our best foot forward linguistically. And I think that's why we just do it sometimes below the radar and just know I better speak this way. Because that Singlish pronunciation, there's going to be times where sounding English or American is not going to be the best way forward. You want to sound more real, maybe. I know the participle, what is it, the la, and even throw a few of those in to sound more Singlish, because that's going to get you, I don't know, cred. And somebody speaking more posh English would work in other contexts. So I think we all do this, just not necessarily aware of it sometimes when it happens. It just happens naturally.
Yeah, really interesting, especially when, I mean, for me, the issue comes when at international conferences that are held in like a non-space like Zoom, I switch between whom I'm talking to and whom I'm seeing in front of the screen. But anyway, I don't know if people have other follow-up questions, or you could also save them for later, but I don't know if Alex will be around.
I should be around till 3 o'clock, so.
Great. Yep. And if you have any further questions, you know, spirit of the stairs and all that, I'm sure you can put that in the chat box, and we can do asynchronous interactions as well. So maybe I can then move on to, well, give a round of applause to Alex, and move on to introduce our next speaker, who is Sarah Fuchs, an area leader in history at the Royal College of Music in London. She writes mainly about operatic culture, audiovisual media and archival practices around the turn of the 19th century. Her essays have appeared in the Cambridge Opera Journal, 19th Century Music Review, and several edited collections. She's currently completing a book tentatively titled Operatic Artifacts, Opera Archives, and Audiovisual Media in Third Republic France. I should also add that this forum has been very kindly convened and organized by Francesca Vella, who is in the background and waving to us. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks so much to Francesca as well for the invitation to be here today. I really appreciate it, and thanks to all of you for turning up. As Shzr Ee said, I am currently still completing a book manuscript on operatic culture around turn of the century France, turn of the 19th century France. And what I'm going to be talking with you about today comes from that book project in part. I've been doing a lot of revisions lately and thinking through my material in new ways, some of which I think touch on some of the topics that Alex has already mentioned, but more than a century ago. So, like Alex, this project is big, and I hope that I've managed to cut it down in a way that makes sense. But if it doesn't at any point, please don't hesitate to just stick a hand up, ask a question, or ask afterwards as well. I would love to hear your thoughts on this material. So what I'd like to talk with you about today is a small collection of sound recordings made about 100 years ago, mostly in the 1910s and the 1920s at France's National Institute for Deaf Mutes. Now, this is, I should just hasten to say, this is the terminology of that time, not our time. Today, this institute is known as the National Institute for Deaf Children. So let me set the scene by telling you a little bit about the collection as a whole, and then I'll give you one case study from it that we can maybe discuss more together. So the collection consists of just 228 wax cylinder recordings, and they're unpublished, which means that they were never replicated, circulated, sold. They're just cylinders made, single copies of cylinders made for a specific purpose. What purpose is a bit unclear, and I'll explain that a little bit more as I go along. They've recently been cataloged and digitized by the French National Library, but they appear to have been in something of a derelict state when they were donated to France's National Sound Recording Library in the late 1930s. So very little is known about who made most of these recordings, when exactly they were made, or why they were made. According to the very limited amount of information provided on the cylinders themselves and the boxes that some of them still have, we can identify a few of the people involved in making the recordings, but most of them are unidentified and unidentifiable today. According to the French National Library's finding aid, the recordings were made in the Deaf Mute Institute's speech laboratory under the supervision of the speech laboratory's first director, who is known as Hector Marichal. Around the turn of the century, he was one of France's leading researchers in the field of deaf-mute education. And again, this is the terminology and the ideology of the time. I realize this sounds really problematic and paternalistic today. Like many educators of the deaf active around the turn of the 19th century, Marichal aimed to help the deaf and members of other linguistically disenfranchised communities, more on that in a minute, speak the French language, or rather, the version of the French language that was considered, that was favored around the time, Parisian French, associated with the seat of power in France, and what the entire country was expected to learn how to speak. Teaching the deaf to speak rather than sign had been common practice among educators in France since the 1880s, when the French state ordered school teachers to stop using sign language and use only speech instead. So it should come as no surprise that most of these sound recordings, these 228 sound recordings made in the speech laboratory, were diction exercises of one kind or another, apparently recorded by the Institute's patients or pupils, however you want to think about them, and their professors. So vowel sounds, for example, simple phrases, that sort of thing. What I was really surprised to find were about a dozen sound recordings made by opera singers. So I want to introduce you to one of these sound recordings that I found in the National Deaf Mute Institute, made by an opera singer. It was made in 1916. We know this because it's written on the cylinder itself, by a member of the Paris Opera's company, a contralto known as Ketty Laperrette. And in her recording, she intones a series of vowel sounds, runs through a few scales, speaks briefly, and then sings an excerpt from Saint-Saëns' opera Samson and Dalila. So a lot is going on in this recording already, and it's only about 2 minutes long. It's the first bit of the recording that's really, really interesting to me. I mean, it's all interesting, but the first bit is what's really got me thinking about this. The vowel sounds are what they are. When she gets to the scales, that's where something weird starts to happen. And the first time she runs through the scale where she shifts from an ah sound to an oh sound happens moving from C4 to D4, and something clicks or glitches. And initially I thought it was just a glitch in the wax cylinder, but she acts as if something's a little bit wrong with her voice in this moment. She comes back to the scale again, and the same thing happens. She falters over this switch from a vowel sound ah to o, from C to D. I could actually play this for you. Let me see if I can get this up. Okay. So I won't play the whole thing for you, but I'll play just the first little, the bits of vowels and maybe the scale. I know it's a bit tantalizing to leave it there. I am happy to play the rest of it for you later if you'd like to hear it. Hopefully you could hear a little bit of what I'm talking about in terms of that glitch going on in that in those two scales, the ah to oh combination. So what is this glitch, and what was she doing at the speech laboratory? What could it offer her by way of a cure, if that is even what she was seeking? So I'm not a speech therapist. I'm not even a very highly trained singer. And so I came at this problem the way at least this musicologist would. So I started with what I could find out from the finding aid. I thought I would try working out what Hector Marichal could offer this singer. So I pursued quite a bit of research about him. So I wanted to know what his methodologies were and what he might have on offer to members of the public who might come into the Deaf Mute Institute or the speech laboratory around the turn of the century. What he thought was that if deaf people could compare their speech against other examples, ideally in visual form, they would learn how to speak properly. And in collaboration with several significant inventors working around this time, he developed audiovisual technologies to visualize speech. I'll share my screen with you once more. So this is chronophotographic images of a man saying, "I love you" in French. This is one of the technologies that Marichal helped to invent and implement in the speech laboratory. The idea being that if you could, in front of a mirror, it's that basic. If you could compare your lips against a photograph like this, or perhaps even have your own lips photographed, you could learn to replicate speech. Another one of the technologies is a little bit more involved. Is a really experimental technology that captured visible traces of the voice via a graphing machine that transferred the long wavy lines left in wax cylinders to paper. So let me just show you this one. So this is the machine itself. Here it is in action. So you can see that this child is recording their voice onto the cylinder, and then it's going to be graphed onto this little bit of paper here. So then they end up with a visual representation that looks something like this. The idea being that you could then compare these wavy traces against someone else's wavy traces and see where you might be going wrong or what you might be getting right, again, in visible form. At this point, it's probably important to say that in France, deaf people and provincial dialect speakers or patois speakers had long been seen as similarly disenfranchised due to their lack of command over the nation's language or preferred language, Parisian French. Similarly in need of linguistic improvement before they could be considered fully fledged citizens. This at least is how they were treated by the state and state-sponsored education. So Marichal and his colleagues, while they worked primarily with deaf students, they also worked with other members of the public, members of the wider public, who would come there seeking various kinds of cures. You can probably guess where this is going. This is what I think that our singer, Katie Leparrette, was doing in the speech laboratory. When I turned my attention to her, what I learned was that she'd been born and raised in the Lower Pyrenees region, deep in the southwest of France. So she would have grown up speaking one of several regional subdialects, which were really, all of them really distinctly different from Parisian French, particularly in their pronunciation of vowel sounds like oh and ah. These same vowel sounds that she stumbles over in her scales in this recording. So the question I started asking myself as I was working through, some of the questions I started asking myself as I was writing this chapter is, could it be that her stumble as she shifts from ah to oh in this sound recording has something to do with where she'd first learned to place these sounds in her mouth as she's growing up? Or could she in fact even distinguish between these sounds, having grown up using them interchangeably in her everyday life? I'll just show you a couple more images. Here she is in the role of Dalila. And here's where she's from, the Lower Pyrenees, deep in the southwest, almost on the Spanish border. And here are some of the regional pronunciations of this sound, in her one of her regional subdialects. So there's 3 different ways that it could be and was pronounced then, and to some extent still today. So this is what I wrote. This is basically what I concluded in my first draft of my book manuscript. As I said, I've been doing some revisions, and as I've been working through these, I found myself wondering whether this story might be just a little bit too neat, just a little bit too dependent on top-down models of scientific knowledge production, and maybe a little too sure that our singer here would have been a passive recipient of whatever therapies were on offer. These questions occurred to me primarily after I went back to the archive earlier this year, where I finally had a chance to listen to the rest of the recordings in this collection. And one of the things that stood out to me as I was listening to all of the other recordings was just what a wide array of activities were really taking place at the Deaf Mute Institute, which the finding aid couldn't really fully capture. Some of the cylinders do indeed seem to capture the oralist method in action. Deaf pupils file in front of the phonograph, painstakingly repeating vowels and phrases after their professors. And some of these are really, really difficult to listen to. Others, though, are less easy to categorize, especially those made by adult members of the deaf community, some of whom even wrote about their experiences after making their recordings. Listening to these in particular, these made by adult members of the deaf community, have made me think about other spaces we might keep open or other kinds of interpretations we might have for these recordings, including La Parette's recording. So some of the questions I'm asking myself now about this recording: could it be that she's not a passive patient, but instead an active investigator of her own voice? Might she have been using the technologies and therapies intended for one purpose for some alternative purpose of her own, thus twisting these tools around on themselves? And if she was indeed trying to eradicate a Southern accent or erase its effects on her singing voice, could she have been doing so wittingly or knowingly, well aware of what she was doing and why she was doing it, but perhaps without necessarily believing all of that nationalist rhetoric around being and sounding French? So all of this has led me to, they're not really conclusions yet, but kind of notes to self as I finish my revisions. As scholars, I think it's really important that we try to resist monolithic narratives about what vocal technologies and trainings did 100 years ago, a century ago, and what they do today, especially when they seem to align a little too neatly with sweeping state-sponsored initiatives or state-mandated initiatives. And I think we also need to take special care with working with early sound recordings, because they're really slippery artifacts, these things that may or may not be what they seem to be, all the more when we encounter them in digital form without any of the context that might help us make sense of them. Thanks very much for your attention. I'd be really happy to field a couple of questions or play the rest of that sound recording.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm just so much struck by how the discourses in some ways have changed, but also not changed in public understandings. Can I invite people in our Zoom room to pose some questions to Sarah, please? Do I see any hands?
I think Jenevora has a hand up.
Go for it.
I don't want to hog the questions, though. If anybody else has got a question or a comment. I'm just listening to this with a singing teacher and a voice science ear. And what I heard on that R on the scale was a register shift. So she started the scale, the middle C was in her lower register, what some people call chest register or M1, and then she shifted on the next tone up into her M2 register. Yep. And it sounded a little bit clunky. The reason there wasn't the register shift on the other vowels is because she started them all in M2. And that's an acoustic phenomenon. That's because of the acoustic impedance of the vocal tract, which means that the E and the U vowel are easier to sing on that sort of transition stage. And she was able to do the middle C in those vowels where she couldn't get the middle C out on her R vowel so easily. The sort of historic precedent here is an interesting one, because that register shift, in old recordings, we hear it much more clunkily than we do in modern recordings. And if you go back even further and listen to people like Adelina Patti recording, she's just yodeling her way through the registers. And it was just obviously totally accepted. That's the way that people sang. I'd love to hear the Dalila aria to see whether there's a bit of that yodeling through that. The ironing out of the registers that we do now didn't seem to matter then. So I'm wondering whether she was bothered by it, actually, whether that was just the way that people sang, and whether she was aware of it being an issue. I don't know. There are lots of other questions it could raise. What does she sound like on the rest of the recording, Sarah?
A little bit rough, to be honest with you. So when she did actually previously record the Samson Dalila excerpt, and on that one she sings it, she sings it at the given pitch. She sings it quite smoothly polished, and in this one she sings it down, I think maybe a whole tone actually, which is a bit strange, and some of the sheen has just left her voice. There's a little bit more context that I just didn't have time to talk about today, but she's a singer who seems to have been slightly more indisposed than other singers based on some of the kind of records left behind by her manager and some of her letters and things. Indisposed, and what that means for a singer, as you of course know, is really, really tricky. And maybe not just singers, maybe any performer being indisposed is a bit of a catch-all. But there is evidence of her seeking various kinds of treatments for her voice. Whether it's to do with exactly this kind of issue isn't as clear as I would like it to be. But it's really helpful to have your views on what's going on with that click or switch sound in the recording. Thanks so much for sharing that.
Thank you so much. Are there other people in the room who'd like to pose a question? Go for it, Francesca.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Sarah. I have a very quick question, probably a rather silly one, but have any scripts survived for the vocalizations that the singers and other deaf-mute people were doing for these recordings? And if so, was the International Phonetic Alphabet used? And also, how familiar would voice teachers and performers have been with these alphabets?
Yeah, those are really great questions. So I haven't found any scripts at all for these wax cylinders. And to be To be honest with you, I'm not even entirely sure that the French National Library is aware that they might have been intended to be graphically realized with these things at all. So this is part of a maybe a second project, a next project, because I'd really like to work with them to see what kinds of materials they might produce if we put them through one of these graphing machines, and what that might have to offer us. The others do exist, and some of the same machines exist as well, but not related to this particular collection. So there's scripts for example, dialect speakers from the late 19th century, early 20th century, working with RHUL, but also other experimental phoneticians of the time. As far as the International Phonetic Alphabet goes and how familiar voice teachers would have been with that, that's a really, really good question. I mean, it was common practice among experimental phoneticians, but not necessarily among voice teachers. There were a handful of voice teachers at the Paris Conservatoire and private teachers around the turn of the century that were coming into regular contact with experimental phoneticians and other kind of voice scientist types. But even their manuals don't necessarily, just thinking, I just don't want to say something that's not true here. I don't know that they necessarily make use of the International Phonetic Alphabet. They do use some of these technologies, like, I've seen a voice teacher make photographs of his lips and, publish those in his voice manual, but just associated with vowel sounds, pitched vowel sounds, as opposed to International Phonetic Alphabet. So it's a really good question. I'll have to give that one some more thought. Thanks, Francesca.
Thank you, Sarah. I actually was very caught by your reference to how disabilities could be and should be thought of as a form of expertise.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at this also in terms of intercultural engagements, bringing some of the work that Alex was talking about earlier, and also some of the work that Jenevora is going to talk about. I was thinking, for example, in Korean pansori opera, you're meant to actually break your voice and go to the wilderness and shout at the void until you cough out blood, and that's part of the aesthetic. But that would be seen as incredibly damaging to, let's say, someone who was looking to develop bel canto style beautiful voice. And then in Chinese opera, what is perceived of as a beautiful voice would be very, very different to different expectations in pops from vocal genres and pop to opera to even within lead. There's just so much variation. And I'm just wondering, this is a question to you, but also potentially to the others who have been presenting and will be presenting, is because we're looking at something that's very physical and tangible, and we're looking at, actual impact on a pair of vocal cords, and there could be irreversible impact one way or another. How do we negotiate all these issues of different aesthetic standards around the science of it, around our framing of these discourses? I know it's very broad, and maybe we could follow this up even after Genevora's session, but I thought I'd put this out here.
I'd be happy for us to follow it up at the end, but just a couple of thoughts that occur to me. I think the thing that I've been really struck by lately is how much of my own kind of apparatus I've brought to this, both the recording and my methodological kind of inclination. So I was inclined, maybe I couldn't help but hear this through modern day ears, but as Jenevora points out, there were different expectations for singers, the way they would sing around this time. So what constitutes potential disability or vocal, even something like vocal fatigue, we hear that differently than they might have heard that. And then there's my kind of methodological inclination. I'm going to, of course, I just think I'll go to the scientist and I'll figure out what the scientist could do, the doctor could do, and then that'll tell me something important. But why not start? Why start top down? That's a bit tired, isn't it? And why is that the way that I think we should, I'm basing my knowledge construction on somebody else's knowledge construction, none of which necessarily takes account of the lived experience of the moment, or what might have been, how these methodologies might have been used, experienced, or even made to work in alternative ways at the time, which feels really, it feels like something important to consider.
Thank you so much. I think now might be a good time to put our hands together to thank Sarah and welcome our next speaker, Jenevora Williams, who is a leading exponent in the field of vocal health and singing teaching. After a successful career in opera, Jenevora turned her attention to investigating healthy and efficient vocal function. The combination of academic study and practical experience has resulted in unique perception for understanding the human voice. She was the first singing teacher to be awarded a PhD in voice science in the UK and won the 2010 BVA Van Lawrence Prize for outstanding contribution to voice research. Her book, Teaching Singing to Children and Young Adults, has been enormously popular with singing teachers throughout the world, and she's well known for her imagination and rigorous international training courses for singing teachers and voice professionals. She now runs vocal health education and evolving voice, training the first generation of voice rehabilitation specialists worldwide. As a teacher of singing, she worked with professional singers of all ages in both voice rehabilitation and career mentoring. Over to you, Jenevora.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll share my screen because I've got some slides to share with you all. And there we go. Just some thoughts and ideas, really. What do we mean by person-centered care, interactions, teaching? What is hierarchical? What is useful? I'm going to start just by really putting this in context. Where am I? This is what I'm doing at the moment in terms of vocal health and rehabilitation. So I work for BAPAM, British Association for Performing Arts Medicine. I work for the Voice Care Centre doing rehabilitation, and I'm also training people to do rehabilitation. So I'm working in different environments with different people, different philosophies of what healthcare and education can look like. My own bias, I'm always inviting my students to give me to articulate what their bias is. I've come from an opera background. I'm also come from an academic background, researching and writing, training teachers, so that's education, and rehabilitation, so I'm working in health. So various different influences and things that are impacting on my own view of the world. My personal bias, just to give you a little perspective on that, I'm the one who goes out and shouts with a placard. I'm a doer, a goer, I make things happen. So sometimes I piss people off. So what's my message going to be? It is questioning the established system. And the established system in both health and education is, I'm the expert, I know best, you do what I say. I'm also very keen, and I think everyone in this space is here because they know that we need to recognize our privilege and bias and hold it accountable. And yes, it is political, political and personal. Personal is political when society and culture limit our potential and our voice. So the hierarchical system here, we've got the expert at the top who is qualified, trained, experienced, and they will say, I know what is wrong with you and I know what you need to do. And in education and music, that may be the curriculum that is handed down to us by the Department of Education. It might be what the exam board says that we need to be doing. It might be the college principal, and then the layers will go down from there. I didn't think I'd be quoting Michael Gove. I think the people of this country have had enough of experts with organisations with acronyms saying that they know what is best and getting it consistently wrong. Well, when might the expert be useful? The expert will have experience, so they may have seen this situation many times before. They are able to fit what they are seeing into a familiar pattern. That we do that all the time. The way our brains organize our experiences is to do with pattern recognition. That is partly what we're educating people to do. So that's a very useful thing, a useful skill to have. When might it be unhelpful is when you get stuck in that pattern recognition and you fail to ask the broader questions. You don't look wider. You might miss things out. I see a lot of people who have been for a specialist ENT appointment, they've been for a specialist gastroenterological appointment, they've been for a specialist it's the words they go sometimes, osteo thing, structural. And they've had these 3 specialist interventions and no one has joined them all together to say, supposing you have, a hypermobility related disorder, and that would affect all of these issues. So it's being broad and wide. And also everybody who's coming into your studio, everyone who's coming into your environment is slightly different. They are the sum of everything that's happened to them. You can't put people into these pigeonholes. So if this isn't going to work, what do we do? Can we actually build a new model that works? And I'm just going to introduce you to this. It's not mine, it's an old idea, the biopsychosocial model. And if we are looking at the person we are teaching or training or helping, there are these interrelated aspects of their health and well-being, of their knowledge, of their perception of the world. So we have the biomedical, which is the medications, the illnesses, the genetics, the biomechanical, which might be the way that they use their body, the way that their singing technique, where they put their fingers on the instrument, the way they stand, the way they sit, the way they walk. And then we've got the psychological, which is not just, mental health issues or whether they have issues from their childhood or whether they've had trauma. It's just everything that's ever been said to them will go in there and impact on the way that they are. And then the sociological, which is the environment, that is where they were brought up, how they were brought up, but it's also the rehearsal room that they've been put in. It's the schedule they've been given. It is the people that they're working with. If they're working with somebody who's bullying them, that's the environment. So all of these things will interact, and in the middle of it, we've got the person. We've got this complex human. And when I talk to people about this, everybody says, oh yes, I'm very holistic in the way that I think. I consider the whole person. And I've had osteopaths saying, yes, I consider the whole person. I look at their feet when they walk in the room. Great, it's a start. Or I've had a doctor saying, oh yes, I tell them that this is going to be stressful. Just leaving those ones open to think about. So it's not about asking the bio and then the social and then the psycho questions. It is about understanding the relationships that they have between themselves and with the person, their lived experience. It's fluid and shifting. And the most important thing is that person that we are working with is the only person who knows what it's like to be them. This is just to put it in perspective. I said it wasn't a new idea. This was Hugh Cairns who made this statement 100 years ago. So let's think of a scenario. If somebody has a vocal problem and they're a smoker, what do we do as either as their teacher or as their health professional? The problem has been caused by the smoking. So we know what's wrong because we know smoking is bad for your health. So the easiest way around is to say, well, if you give up smoking, then I can help you. Then we can sort things out. And there's an implication there that they have a choice over this, that they have done it themselves, that they might be stupid, and I will help you when you change to fit my model of ideal behavior. What could it look like? We could think about what is going on for that person. Why are they smoking? There's complicated reasons for these things. Instead of judging them, respect them, find out what's happening in the wider context of their life. Thinking about these self-sabotaging behaviors, all right, there's the visible ones, which are the addictions like smoking and maybe drinking, being overweight. Then there are the less obvious self-sabotaging issues like not exercising, like eating, having a diet that is unhealthy. I mean, is that always somebody's choice? Poor sleep, it's not necessarily a choice. And then there are behaviors that actually are worn as a badge of honor. So overworking, perfectionism, self-criticism, criticism of others, they are all impacting on our health. Then behaviors that happen out of awareness. So these may be from attachment issues, from childhood experiences. Why would we give them different responses? Why would we blame someone for one choice of behavior and have empathy with them for another choice of behavior? And is this part of our bias? So who am I to judge you for being a smoker? So if I make you feel bad, what are you going to do? You're going to go outside and you're going to light up a fag because you're feeling awful and you're going to give yourself a little bit of a boost. Instead, I could meet you on your terms. Where do you want to go? I can help you maybe to feel a bit better about yourself. Listen to you. Find some ways to use your voice that might make it a bit easier. No mention of smoking. Make those steps with you. Person-centered interaction. Are these changes going to be possible? Well, I've become used to the fact that if you want something to change, you make it happen, and most of the world will oppose you, and you'll just keep ploughing on, and eventually they'll realize that it's happening anyway. If you wanted to know more about what I'm doing, there's some websites to look stuff up on. There's lots of free resources on YouTube. There's free resources on my website. There's all sorts of other things you can connect with if you wanted to know a little bit more about these training opportunities. So I'm now going to come out of the slides and see if anyone else has any anything they want to say.
Thank you so very much, Jenevora, and um, very positive, forward-looking provocations. I think there are people applauding, and I suspect people are ready to ask you questions. So let's see if there are any hands up.
Alex has got his hand in the air.
Thanks. Thank you, both of you, for the presentations. I'm just having listened to Sarah and yourself, and then think about my context. Seems there's a common theme here, and that is about, at least as I understand it, is about this getting away from this one-size-fits-all perspective. Whether it's about what is a standard accent, whether it's about, as you had mentioned, Sarah, you mentioned, I think, monolithic, and that rang a bell, and likewise here, your presentation with regard to, well, the thing I picked up on is cultural bias and stuff, how we, even the major seventh, I didn't realize, to me, I'd always thought that's a very discordant sound, but you mentioned, that no, it depends on the culture. There's nothing inherent, so it is about power. Whether it's whatever the power is the base of, class, race, gender, and so on. And maybe that sounds obvious, especially to the three of us, because we do a lot of research on this, but it is a common theme, I think, more and more nowadays. And we're tapping into that in different ways. This, one size fits all, and this is how it should be done, or should be treated, or should be sung, or should be spoken, etc. And little by little chipping away at that the belief system. And then somebody's getting slagged off for it when we do. And I certainly have. I was attacked by someone on their blog, both here and in the US. Someone in the US saw my research, referred to me as the British fag with bad teeth. Never see me, he doesn't know me from Adam. Yes. I don't mind being called British, or I don't care what they call me. But it's just childish. You can't even engage with that because they thought it was political correctness gone mad. But it's just, change takes time. Well, but thank you. They're all. Hopefully, everyone's got something out of our talks. But that certainly stood out to me. And chipping away at this, as you said, Sarah, monolithic perspective. Which, once you start to question things, then you get questioned. That's how it is. But it's worth keep chipping away.
Yeah. And keep asking ourselves, keep looking inwards as well as outwards. It's very easy to just sort of wag your finger at other people's practice. And I come from an incredibly privileged background of being fed and educated and nurtured, and it's very easy to sit comfortably in that. And I think it's very useful to just keep asking ourselves, what am I doing? How am I doing it? How am I respecting you? What can you offer? I was just thinking, this is another thought I had about when Sarah was talking about how we judge voices and how we judge what is healthy and what isn't, and we've shifted. I think we've really shifted our perception of singing voice. That pop singing is not unhealthy. That distortion is not unhealthy. That people can use all sorts of different techniques, and as long as they can repeat it and sustain it, then it's absolutely fine. And my own research years ago, when I was looking at adolescent voice change in boys, the standard measurements that speech therapists use to measure health aspects like breathiness and roughness and weakness, those teenage boys going through voice change fail on all of them because of the instability. And yet growing is a perfectly healthy thing to do. So it is just reframing these judgments that we make.
Definitely. Yep. And learn from our students, I think, too. with a large percentage of Chinese students on the program I teach on, and they look up to you as a teacher and admit, in a hierarchical society like China, the teacher is way up at the top. And I've learned, and it's, especially as a linguist, when they send emails to you and start with "My dearest professor, so sorry to disturb you, sorry for taking your valuable time." And initially, my thought was, it sounds a bit, I have to be honest, obsequious. But then you realize, well, no, there are cultures coming through in the language, so you wouldn't tell them, which I did not. I'm happy to say, "Oh no, just call me Alex." Maybe they don't want to call me Alex. Maybe they don't feel comfortable. Maybe they can't. They've been speaking and they've been culturalized for 20 odd years, and then 1 year in England is not going to. So, and some might say, "Oh, I'd rather just do it." That's fine. So that is just one way of many. And some of the things they use in their essays, like researches, which I'm convinced is China English at this point. Because if it was so-called Chinglish, it'd be much more random and unpredictable. But when you have Chinese students of all kinds, really high proficiency, saying researches, we're saying, "No, that's fine. We're not going to say, no, this is wrong." It's just different. Over 1 billion people can't get it wrong. So whether it's language, whether it's singing, whether it's anything, that whole one size, I keep coming back to the term, I can't think of none better, and challenging, well, who said this? Who's in power? Why do we go along with this? Not to be rebels, just to see, society is changing, so attitudes have to change too.
I could turn my talk on its head and say that I'm the person-centered interactions as a way of teaching might be deeply uncomfortable for some people from certain cultures. They want to be told what to do. That is how that is what they know, and that is what makes them feel comfortable. And if you start saying, "How do you feel? What do you want to do with this? How do you think this might progress?" They look at you and freeze, because you're the expert and you should know.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then we say, "Oh, they lack critical thinking skills." No, they don't. They don't. Otherwise, they wouldn't be at university in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought I'd jump in as someone who's actually actively researching the stereotyping of students from East Asia and UK higher education, and especially in the performing arts. It's been something that I'm very aware of and trying to think about consciously and adapt to in the classroom. I guess my question to people here is, what happens when you're a facilitator and you are supposedly running that classroom, and it's not just about you and that student, it's about that student and other students, and what conversational level, how do we readjust expectations, how do you deal with marking different pieces of work that come from different starting points and different endpoints as well. I mean, one thing that I think I've been trying to tell lots of people about is, it's not just about expectations of the classroom, it's expectations of what happens when you graduate. For a lot of students from overseas, their careers are going to be not necessarily in the UK or the US or Europe. So maybe English is not really that important in terms of how it is a vehicle for expression and then communication or critical thinking as well. And how do we listen in translation? How do we, I was just thinking about the therapeutic aspects and therapeutic technologies. And, I think one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is what do we think about translation software in the class, as well as things like ChatGPT? Because if we're going to have software that help people to hear better, or to see better, how is this different from these kinds of software that can enable different, well, I don't know about better, but at least different modes of communications? And is it even fair to compare one which would be defined in terms of disability as an expertise, as opposed to a cultural, I wouldn't even want to use the word difference these days. I don't know. Lack of alignment, or celebrate the difference in itself. You cannot equate both experiences, and yet there's so much overlap. But since we are all in some ways educators, I guess, and practitioners in this room, it's one thing to talk about one-to-one relationships. So what if we have to sort of run the room and then deal with the fallout of complaints or compliance management. I'm very, very curious as to what people's strategies are and recommendations for good practice.
I can jump in, though I don't want to hold the floor here. It's a really, really interesting issues that you've raised, and ones that I'm thinking about a lot especially since joining the Royal College of Music. I've only been there about a year now, almost exactly a year actually, and so I'm still finding my feet with the students, but most of our students are non-native English speakers. And I've come in at a really interesting time with the kind of sudden meteoric rise of ChatGPT and other AI technologies. So one of my tasks over the summer was actually thinking through how we address these technologies with the students, and how we might actually integrate them in a useful way. Just cut me off if I'm rambling here. But so one of the things I think about in terms of one of the things I've been thinking about in terms of ChatGPT is how we might help our students figure out what it's good for and what it's not good for. And I find myself punching a lot of questions into it, including in tutorials with students. And what can it tell us? What can we find out? But we've also been using it with the students. We've been asking them to use it in their quizzes and test what they're learning in their lectures against what ChatGPT tells them and that sort of thing. So a kind of way of helping them acquire knowledge and also exercise critical skill with this new thing. And they're kind of annoyed with it at this point in the term. They're like, why are you asking us to use these tools that are so unreliable? And it's an exciting thing to see happen, actually. But coming back to the issue of sort of the non-native English speakers and how we kind of and how we manage classroom interactions. I mean, and this will probably just sound like a very basic thing, but one of the tools I use in the classroom is just to build in little moments of pause and reflection and actually real-time writing. And it doesn't actually even have to be in English, but just sort of free writing so that students can go away and think about a question that I have posed to them, and then come back and tell the rest of the class about that, which I think begins to move us in a kind of in a direction that doesn't necessarily favor native English speakers. At least that's what I hope it's doing. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much. Yeah, something that I've been trialing is to just break up the way people sit in different groups with small little exercises, and then get people to talk to the person sitting next to them in the new formation. Yeah, but it's moving things back to voice. It's tricky how who feels empowered to use it in whatever circumstance. And going back to Genevora's point about how sometimes we are expected to help people download information as opposed to engage in a conversation or a discourse because of different modes of learning, I guess. I mean, I've taught in East Asia and Southeast Asia, and I feel that there isn't a lack of critical thinking at all. It's just that there are different contexts and ideas of what public spaces and safe spaces are. So there are reasons for why people don't talk as openly or as freely in some classrooms as opposed to at a cafe, where different kinds of engagements take place. So what do we do? Turn our classrooms into a cafe, which might be a way forward. Bringing food and drink. But I did have a thought about actually your presentation, Sarah. At what point does music become its own sort of separate category away from spoken word or speech? Like, do people, when people think about different I won't even use the word disabilities per se. I was just thinking about how the rules are different when you're pronouncing words that are matched to, let's say, a melody. I mean, I know there's lots of research in, Chinese opera studies, for example, because of the tonal qualities of various Chinese dialects and how this has a huge impact on melodic elaboration and so on. So, of course, because how you enter the final desired tone, how you enter that will inflect the actual word that you are singing and change the meaning of it. So there are different rules, and then things as opposed to, like stylized speech in musical theater versus pure vowels. And these, I mean, I'm saying that I acknowledge that there will definitely be, contextual and genre differences, but to what extent do people actually think about how performance as opposed to everyday speech is its own category, and we make a different set of rules? I mean, then again, I can sort of critique that very statement and say that performance is a whole spectrum. But anyway, I'll let you answer that question.
Thanks for that question. It's really, it's a really, really good one, and one that has maybe a different answer for turn of the 19th century France as than it would elsewhere, or even in France in different moments in time. So, and this has to do with the kind of longer history of politicization of language in the country and all of that. But and also has to do with kind of nationalized schools of singing and the way that those start to kind of splinter off into separating much more rigid kinds of things around the later 19th century. In France around this time, essentially, teachers who really espoused kind of all of the many different subtle shades of the French language and its vowel sounds in particular were urging singers to sing with as close to spoken vowels as possible. That hadn't been common practice for a long time, even in France, because Italian sounding vowels had been considered better for that beautiful sound that you mentioned earlier. But in this particular moment, for largely political reasons, spoken French becomes a kind of ideal for sung French as well. Which is really, really tricky when some of the same old operas are being performed as had been for the past, 50, 60, 70 years. So the way they sound changes quite strikingly. I imagine others in the room have wider thoughts about this. I only know my little corner there.
Thank you so much. Lots to think about. And obviously we talk about intercultural differences, but they're intergenerational differences as well. And obviously the voice also changes, as we age, and not to mention gender, a whole new dimension, and climate change and environment. Yeah, are there thoughts or questions from the audience? Or if you would prefer to type a comment or a question in the chat box while we're processing this.
I see that Richard has a hand up.
Hi, can I go ahead? I'm Richard Strivens. I teach singing, and I've got grey hair. I've got white skin, and I've been since I'm interested in family history. My family comes from these islands for a long time. Just to give a bit of background to me. Thank you, everybody who's spoken, and for the three speakers. It's really interesting. I'm not quite sure what my question is going to be. I've been trying to, over the last 5 minutes, trying to work out what want to ask you, but it's an experience that is cropping up more and more, maybe because I'm more alert to it, or maybe that I teach more of a bigger variety of students. I've realized that when people sing in, I'm going to cut what I've got to say quite short, but when people sing in their own accent, they seem much, yes, this is, they seem much more at ease, basically. The other way of putting it, which is probably what I mean, is if you assert that you have to sing with a standard English accent, whatever that is, then there seems to be a possibility of loss of emotional communication as a consequence. And I guess I'm hoping that that speaks to all three talks in its different ways, and whether you've had experiences of this sort of either emotional release or emotional held backness as a consequence of maybe even a subconscious need to sing in a certain way. And when, perhaps this is because just recently it happened in quite an obvious way to me, that I saw this happen, those sort of like eyes lit up and the possibilities opened up with a particular student. It's rather vague, but if any three of you want to respond, or anybody else want to respond to that, would be wonderful. Thank you.
I've got a couple of things that I could reply. Yeah, absolutely. Getting somebody in their own spoken voice. I do a lot of work going from speech to singing, back to speech to singing, and just finding the links, finding the ways in through speech. And yes, you can get a much more honest emotional connection that way. There is a flip side to that if you are singing in a very stylized way, for example, in operatic singing, where the acoustic changes you need to make with your voice in order to get over an orchestra will shift the vowels that you're singing. It will make it a lot more stylized. And when people apply their own accent or their own language often to that particular way of singing, it can be less effective than one they've learned from just as a singing language. I mean, when I went to college, I learned how to sing in many different languages. I can't speak in them, I can't have a conversation, but I can pronounce them impeccably. So that's very useful for my singing. And sometimes you find people singing in their own language just don't do it as well in that particular style. So that is a stylistic thing rather than a direct emotional connection.
Thanks, Jenevora. Yes, that rings a lot of bells. And I think the way that I perhaps think of it is that having a vast palette of different, should we use vowel sounds as the go-to thought, is so valuable, and that some people think of their own personal set of vowel sounds as not being valid within that spectrum. And the moment that they realize that, oh, I naturally make that sound, I didn't know that it was allowed. This is the kind of language that you can so easily hear. I think is, well, it's in some ways it's wonderful because they've got so much access to so much more than they thought they had.
Yeah, I love hearing messy diphthongs and splurgy vowels. Much more human, much more real.
Do we have any more questions? Feel free to use the chat box. While we are using the chat box or not, could I also invite our speakers to maybe leave your website or your email address in the chat box for anyone who might think of a question later, and they could possibly follow up. Great, thank you so much. I think quite a number of us are still processing the very rich conversations. I mean, I also feel very heartened to see how there is a lot of empathy and compassion in what has been shared today. And, you know, I'm very encouraged by the fact that all of us are also practitioners, educators, and researchers who hopefully can, you know, take all these conversations forward in our general work every day. So maybe now might be a good time to bring our heads together to thank our three researchers and presenters, and also Francesca, who brought this together in the first place. And if there are more questions, you know where to direct them to. Yeah, to thank everyone for coming to this session and participating and listening and sharing. So I don't know if you have other formal announcements to make, Francesca.
No, so, well, you know, first of all, thank you to you, Shzr Ee, for chairing the session as well. And again, thanks, Sarah, Jenevora, and Alex for joining us. And so the recording will be made available in the next few days or couple of weeks on the EDIMS website. So feel free to, you know, share it with other people, you know, friends and colleagues who might be interested. And yeah, and thank you again for joining us today.
Great. There will be a few more EDIMS events happening. Do check the EDIMS events website and join our mailing list if you're already not on it. So I guess happy Friday. We are all released on good behavior, and yeah, we'll be free to think about what to do over the weekend and the rest of our musical EDI inspired lives.